You, what's up, everybody? It's Chris from Brooklyn Wildlife. I hope you're doing well. I'm gonna invite some people here. In the meantime, make sure you got your mask. Now, also keep in mind, I'm gonna be doing these custom joints. If you can see, this is a person's face on here. I can print on silk. I'm about to get more ink this week so we can get it popping. But I just wanted to have a conversation about hip hop. Recently, with the election coming up and with everything going on socially and the civil unrest and the reactions to police being brutal and then being more brutal to people and then basically going on strike against the people and then being more brutal to people, we've been having a lot of very serious conversations. We've been talking a lot about politics, been talking a whole lot about society, been talking a whole lot about racism, sexism, and things of that nature. And I want to return it to something that I love, which is hip hop. And right now, I don't get to rap as much as I'd like to. I don't get to go to shows like I'd want to. I don't get to see other artists the way I'd like to. And it's starting to really affect me. Like, I know it's been 6-7 months of not having shows and everyone's in the house, and there are tons of things we could talk about in terms of food scarcity and health issues and people we know who've gotten sick or who've passed away. But on a level of like artists, in America, we aren't being supported. In other countries, I think France gave out money to artists and are saying, we want to make sure y'all are still around when this pandemic's over. In certain European countries, they're like, yo, let's support the artists. Let's make sure the artists have something to come back to. Let's make sure that there's a safe way to approach doing events. Let's have some uniform way of being cautious about it. In America, who knows what's happening right now? We got the governors fighting with the president, the mayors fighting with the governors, certain cities that want to close and the governor makes them stay open, certain cities where the governor, certain states where the governor wants it to close and the cities sue. So let's just talk about hip hop. And recently there was a interview with Busta Rhymes, and he was talking about the MCing and being the vocalist having ties to Jamaican roots and toasting. And if folks don't know what that is, I'm not Jamaican, so I'm not going to speak on it as if I know. But from what I've been told, it's kind of the idea of like the artist that would speak over the DJ and kind of what we consider MC, wouldn't necessarily rap, but would like say certain things, would get the crowd hype, would kind of engage with the people that were there at the show. And so the question is like, when he tied it to the Jamaican beginnings and Kool Herc being Jamaican and the sound clash and the sound systems and bringing out the speakers on the big trucks or putting them outside, that was a Jamaican tradition, and that MCing and certain elements of hip hop come from Jamaica. A couple of my friends who are Jamaican and Caribbean shared it and were like, yeah, dog, we've been trying to tell you. And a whole bunch of other people got upset and were like, nah, hip hop's Black American and this and that. And then other people were like, why are we talking like it's this or that? It goes all the way back to Africa. And so I wanted to address this and just get right to it because I love hip hop, I love this conversation, and I think we should continuously have it and continuously search and try to learn more about the origins of what we consider to be hip hop. In my mind, hip hop is the quintessential postmodernist art form. It's bricolage. It takes all these disparate and different parts and puts them together in a way that was not foreseen before. It's not just collage where we take these different images and put it together in another image. We literally are taking bricks and chewing gum and painting and fashion and all these things that aren't supposed to be next to each other, putting it together and making new technology. When people think about hip hop, they don't realize that Grandmaster Flash came up with a transformer. They had someone had to come up with a way of going from one record to another during the DJ set to capture the break that became the loop for the artist to rap over. That technology wasn't there. We had to come up with new equipment in order to sample, in order to do the art. And so hip-hop is something very unique to a time and place. But I will ask, does any cultural product have one source of origin? Does it come from one place, one group of people at one time? And I would challenge that notion at every point. So from my homies that say it comes out of Jamaican background, let's explore that. Were folks using big sound systems outside and having people play records and speaking over the records? Yes. And that is Jamaican, that is known. If you look up the history, look at the sound systems, the sound clash, the bashments, and literally cats would bring out these huge like speakers stacked on top of speakers on top of speakers, like wall of speakers outside and do shows in public spaces. And Kool Herc is Jamaican. And so when we think of Sedgwick Avenue and we think of the start of hip hop, is it the Bronx? It's normally tied to Kool Herc and a particular block party or a particular community day that was in the rec center, what have you. And that's tied to then the time period where it used to steal electricity from the power poles and run the sound system outside in the park. Any of the people that are post 40 years old, tell the young folks the myth and the story. Now, do I know if that's what really happened all the time? No, I grew up in DC. I was born in 1978. So I didn't get to see what hip hop was in the Bronx in 1976, 77, before the actual records got pressed. The things that led to Sugar Hill Gang having a record, the things that led to the artists that we now know of as the progenitors of hip hop being able to put their records out. That means people in the mid 70s or early 70s were actually doing hip hop before it turned into a recorded form of art and expression. I wasn't there, but from what I'm told, the Kool Herc and Sedgwick and the Bronx, South Bronx, is the home in New York for certain elements of it, and that comes from Jamaica. And there are other people that will reinforce that. Other people will say hip hop started in Queens in New York. Again, not my argument to have. Other folks would say, well, nah, how are we even defining hip hop? Those are two parts of it, the DJ and the rapper. But hip hop's also the graffiti. And hip hop's also the fashion. It's the beatbox. It's the dance. And so when we look at the dance can go all the way back to like Lindy hopping in like the 20s, or go back into the 1800s and go back to, we could take that all the way to Africa with certain dance styles when we think about twerking. That theoretically comes from African and West African dance styles and patterns. And you can see that, right? When you see like everybody jump, you can see the Maasai people for who knows how long who do the straight jumping, all right? Then when we think about the graffiti, well, Bammers were writing on the walls in North Africa how many, possibly tens of thousands of years ago? Whether you're looking at in what's now the Sudan, or what's Egypt, or what was Kush, Ethiopia, Kemet, we can see that people have been painting and writing on the walls and using the walls and the space and the environment around us to convey messages in symbol form for who knows how many thousands of years, like literally millennia, right? But something different when theoretically in Philadelphia, folks start tagging and start using spray paint and aerosol cans to put their name up in the city. Now, is that them beautifying the city? Is that them just being egotistical and narcissistic? Is that people saying we have no outlet for expression, so we're going to take it to the public? And is that some way of combating how frequently we're inundated with marketing materials and other public imposition of images and words on us? And so that graffiti artists take that back and they write on the walls, they leave their tag, they let people know that they were alive and that their lives matter, you know? Then when we think about the spoken word parts, maybe we're saying like, well, hip hop started in the Bronx and Jamaican sound system, but what about the last poets? Gil Scott Heron, my aunt thinks he was like one of the first rappers. Someone on here just said James Brown was like one of the early rappers. And who's one of the people that all the rappers sampled? James Brown, you know, and the musicality of it comes from everywhere. But when we think about the spoken word, and this is the thing of like, how do we trace the different parts of it? Because there's something unique about hip hop, right? You didn't have turntables and the DJ with the electrical equipment sampling Aerosmith to make Walk This Way, or you didn't have people making Rapture or Rapper's Delight back in 1600 Mali. And so there's something unique that happened in New York City during the mid to late 70s. Damn it, don't be calling me, man. I'm doing a thing. So there's something unique that brings it all together in New York, theoretically. But the spoken word part, we can trace that to the last poets. We can trace that to Gil Scott Heron. We can trace that to spoken word artists in Chicago, which then ties into New Orleans and the jazz scene, and maybe some of the people who are scatting and some of the vocal patterns that you hear in jazz and bebop and blues. That's roots of hip hop. Because when you listen to some of our old vocals, it's like, oh, I hear it. I hear the basis of hip hop, but it's one part of it. They weren't doing the graffiti at the same time. They weren't doing the same type of dances at the same time. They didn't have the fashion at the same time. They didn't have the DJ equipment. So we got to think like, what makes it hip hop? And hip hop isn't just the rap part. And this is why I'm glad you brought this up, Mr. Dean, that we have to understand the hip-hop tradition is bricolage. It's not just one component. So if people want to say the oral tradition is the root of it, to a certain extent, is the oral tradition the root of the dance? That's, again, all these things are African. All humanity came out of Africa. But when we talk about the uniqueness of a time and space, or what makes something hip hop as different than the blues, or as different than jazz, or different than bebop, or different than swing, or different than soul, or different than rock music, because black people came up with that. All these music forms come out of black culture, but there's something unique when you have the DJ, the MC, the b-boy, the graffiti artist, the fashion makers, the beatboxers, happening at a time and a place that is totally unique. And to me, that's where we get into the hip-hop part. And so I don't need to argue over where did hip-hop start. Let's trace the lineage to all parts of it. Let's look at what black culture was happening, or what black culture was doing in Chicago in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Let's look at what the folks were doing in Louisiana and in New Orleans at the end of the Civil War, and when instruments were made available and the jazz and the big band stuff started happening. Let's look at the dance moves that carried over from West Africa into Brazil and Angola, coming over to Brazil with capoeira and the martial arts. And so I'm not saying you're wrong, Mr. Dean. What I'm saying is I don't call that stuff hip hop. I understand, and I think you came into this chat a little bit late, that people were writing on the walls back in Kemet. I mentioned that. People were doing the dances like the Maasai in Mali, or people in South Africa were doing dances, and that it influenced what's hip hop now. The drum and the heartbeat orientation. And so I'm not saying that these various components, but what I said is there was no turntables. There was no plug in the big ass speakers and rock out in the park. And so that's not the same thing. They may be tied to these things, but also we got to be careful where we want to see attachment to things, because that follows a narrative we like. And so I like to tie all these things to African history, African traditions, and to truly get into them, you want to end up at a source point. But when we talk about hip hop, we got to also recognize that there's something unique in the time and place, and with the sampling and with the using of rock music at different times, blues music, soul music, jazz music, and what that turned into. And so I'm of the mind that instead of arguing over it and people being like, no, it's Jamaican, and as Jamaicans and Caribbeans, we started it all, or saying, well, I'm from New York, and so New Yorkers started it all, or saying, nah, it really came out of jazz in New Orleans, or it really came out of... What I'm saying is learn the total history. Take into consideration the things that Mr. Dean is saying, take into consideration the people that totally disagree with him, and that say that those things that you're pointing to, hieroglyphics and graffiti, are not the same thing. Now, me personally, I attach, like I said at the beginning of this, that Bama's been writing on the walls for millennia. I attach this thread line. I don't know if it's due to genetics. I don't know if it's due to cultural retention and remembrance. And when people have traveled, these skills and these traditions traveled with them. But I know that it turns into an argument that for me is fruitless. I'd much rather have the conversation of how to celebrate all these things. And that when we want to learn about hip hop, we got to be careful about VH1 teaching us the narrative. Now, being from DC, the way I experienced hip hop was much different. And go-go music, and seeing Backyard and Junkyard and Rare Essence and Northeast Groovers and EU and these type of artists, Chuck Brown. And so for me, the way I even came across hip-hop was different. We weren't back spinning on linoleum out in my neighborhood back in the mid-'80s. We were listening to go-go music up until 95, 96, 97. Go-go music was the main thing in DC. And I fell in love with hip-hop through media. But I also know that that's not real. And so when I hear these stories of everything started in the Bronx, yeah, that's what VH1 is saying, and they are following a certain thread that a limited number of people have agreed upon, and now it's turning into a worldwide story. And so I would tell anyone interested to go research, look into what was happening in California, in New Orleans, in Chicago, in St. Louis, in how it developed in Miami, and the difference between Booty Shake and what's going on with the club music down there, and how it ties into the house music that came out of Chicago, and the techno music that came out of Detroit, and the electronic music scenes that influenced hip-hop. Look into the DJ culture, look into the breakdancing culture, and the b-boy culture, and the breaking culture, and follow these thread lines. And what we will see is that humans over time all do very similar things. Cats don't want to listen to me, but when you look at line dancing and country music and white folks, go back far enough, you'll see some Africans that do some very similar music. Does that mean that they had any awareness of each other? No. It's a factor like humans can only do certain things with their body in a certain rhythm. And so there are going to be things that look like they're tied together that aren't. But maybe they are. Maybe there are things that have culturally continued to transpose and exist throughout hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. All right, so I just wanted to have this quick conversation. I appreciate you, Mr. Dean, from dropping some science in there and giving people some breadcrumbs to follow. But do the knowledge. Don't just listen to what people are telling you on VH1 or putting on the internet. If you want to know more about the Jamaican sound system, then look at the Alpha School for Boys. Go check out that movie Rockers. Go look at how the dub music scene started in Jamaica and the reggae scene started in Jamaica. And the title, like, yeah, Bob Marley played doo-wop music. He used to wear a shirt and tie before he grew out his locks and then became, music for the people, which all of a sudden gets played at Jimmy Buffett stuff all over, Margaritaville all day long. Look into the Last Poets. Learn about Amiri Baraka. Learn about the Last Poets and the folks like Gil Scott-Heron. Learn about the jazz artists and the bebop artists and what was happening with Sun Ra and the orchestra. Get into James Brown and some of the vocal intonations and some of the patterns that were being used by artists like that. Look into Fela Kuti. Look into all these artists that help make up what we see now and understand how it influenced the artists we grew up off of. Because I was 10 in 1988. So when people started talking about the golden era of hip-hop was 88, that wasn't golden era for me. I couldn't even experience most hip-hop. My golden era was more so when I was in high school through college. So I'm looking at like 94, I'll start with 92, but really like 94 through about 98. That's when like hip-hop was so live to me, even up to probably like 2000. And then there's another part of it with the indie artists and the folks that cats never heard of, but for me that were heavily influential. And so just do the knowledge, do the research. Nothing exists in a vacuum. Everything comes from something. They want to tell you the Big Bang. It was like first there was nothing and it imploded on itself and made everything. Well, that doesn't make sense. But that's for another conversation. When it comes to culture and history and hip hop, just research it. Talk to people. Follow their leads and keep researching. Don't just argue. And that's why I want to say thank you, Mr. Dean, for giving your input. Anyone who has questions about this, hit me up. I can point out more names, whether it's Grand Wizard Theodore, Kaz, whether it's Busy B. And when we think about how hip-hop started and Fab Five Freddy and Blondie, and how did that even come to be? How come the first hip-hop movies happened? When we think about Crush Groove or we think about Breakin' and how that's different from Crush Groove, or Wild Style or Style Wars, and how PBS was involved. And it took people with outside money from outside our community to publicize it. So what was really happening in the early 70s, mid 70s? What was really happening in the late 60s that led to what we consider hip-hop to be? And let's not think hip-hop is only one of the facets. It's not just the rap. It's not just the DJ. It's not just the b-boy and the dancing. It's not just the painting. It's when all of it comes together in a certain time, certain place, and from a certain community, which it seemed to have been Caribbean, Latinx, Black, and pretty early on there were some Jewish folks and white folks involved. All right? And now it's a worldwide phenomenon. So I love talking about hip-hop. Anyone has any questions, hit me up. I'm going to be doing more of these and go a bit deeper because right now I want to keep it surface. But if we want to go deeper, I'm going to be doing discussions on my Patreon where we can talk about these individuals and we can talk about the history and the beef between MC Shan and KRS-One. What are you saying? Rapture. That's right. We can talk about white lines. We can talk about these early overlaps between. I think it was Public Enemy, where he said, I make hip-hop because I never dug disco. And I love that. But early hip-hop came right out of disco and was wearing tight pants. So anybody worried about me wearing my tight-ass pants or my tights, go look at early hip-hop artists. Go look at what Grandmaster Flash was wearing. Go look at what the artists that folks revered in the mid to late 70s were wearing. And then go look at what Prince was wearing. And I'm not even going to talk about all that. But understand, it's all love. It's hip-hop. And I'll see y'all soon. Peace.